Jairo Lugo-Ocando has many stories to tell, and he certainly shares some of those in this episode of El Café Latinx. One of them really stuck with me. Among many other things, Jairo is editor of a journal, and he said that one of his proudest accomplishments editing this journal is when he helped publish the very first paper about media and communication in Haiti written by a professor who's in Haiti. A person who, to make ends meet, has to drive a taxi during the day and then teach at night. Which makes me think, do we really understand the labor conditions of the people working in academia in Latin America or in the global south more generally? Do we acknowledge all the sacrifices that they go through in order to produce knowledge? About this and many other super interesting stories, we talked with Jairo Lugo-Ocando in this episode of El Café Latinx. What's the experience of being a Latinx scholar in the field of communication and media studies? What are the main challenges and opportunities that come with our identities? These are the issues that we'll talk about in El Café Latinx, where some of the leading voices in the field will share their professional experiences. Hola, my name is Pablo Boczkowski. I teach at Northwestern University, where I hold the Hamad bin Khalifa Al Thani Chair in Communication. Together with Mora Matassi, doctoral student at Northwestern and executive producer of this podcast, we invite you to discover the journeys of scholars who are at the cutting edge of creating knowledge about Latinx communication across the Americas. These are our stories. Esas son nuestras historias. Estas son nuestras historias. Welcome to this new episode of El Café Latinx. We have a great speaker today, Jairo Lugo-Ocando from Maracaibo, Venezuela, currently in Doha, Qatar. He is professor in residence and director of executive education and graduate education at Northwestern University in Qatar. Before, he was on the faculty at several universities in the UK, most recently at the University of Leeds. He's also held visiting positions at a number of universities in the US, Latin America, and Asia, including Columbia in New York, Andrés Bello in Venezuela, and National University of Singapore. He's the author of 9 books. His most recent one is Foreign Aid and Journalism in the Global South, A Mouthpiece for Truth. And his work has been funded by numerous agencies, totaling more than $1 million in external funding. Jairo, welcome to El Café Latinx. It's truly a pleasure to have you here.
The pleasure is all mine, Pablo. Thank you for inviting me.
My pleasure, my friend. So let me ask you, how did it all begin? How was the start of a journey that led you to become a professor and to live in Doha, Qatar today?
Well, it wasn't really my own making as much as external circumstances. I was working as a journalist in Venezuela, and in 1998, as everybody knows, Hugo Chavez wins the elections. And I had issues with governments in the past. We created actually the first online newspaper in Venezuela called Diario del Lago. That was in 1994, 95. So we had problems with the previous government, Rafael Caldera. And then when the new government came into power, we knew that we were going to have problems. We had created a new print newspaper called La Verdad, which still exists. It's in Maracaibo. I was the chief news editor of La Verdad, and Chavez wins in 1999, and we knew the person who would become in that time his vice president, Jose Vicente Rangel, was a very good friend of my family, and said to my family that things with journalists will get difficult, and that was his exact words, and they did. So I talked to my then wife, saying let's go out, let's do a master's or something. And in August 1999, I left to Lancaster University to do a master's. And my idea was never to stay in the UK or to basically to become an academic. It was not in the radar. I was going to go back into journalism, which was the profession I loved and I did and I cherished. And I just was doing my master's when a professor, Martin Edmonds, who died this year, by the way, rest in peace, in the Department of Politics in Lancaster, says, have you thought of doing a PhD? And I said, no, and I don't really have the money. I was with a scholarship. I didn't really have, I mean, you know, I got a good salary in Venezuela, but not a salary to pay a master's degree in Europe or the United States. So he says, because a friend of mine is doing wants a good candidate, and I think you can win the project. Can you put a project together? And I say, yeah, I can do that. And I wrote a project. He liked the way I wrote, and I didn't think that my English was particularly good in that time. And I ended up in Sussex under the late Alan Coulson to look at. And it was a very interesting PhD because it was half in the Department of Media Studies in Sussex and half in the Institute for Development Studies, which is a well-known development. So I did my master's in ICT and development, which is an area I didn't expect, but that was the project that was available. You know, it's not what you want to research. Is if you're coming from the global south, it's where's the money? And so I did my PhD, and during the time I was doing PhD, I got my first job with a college of Greenwich University in London. And from there, I moved to Liverpool Young Moors, and then I went to Scotland, where by that time people started to know me. And in really my academic career, really, although I started before, really started in Stirling. I was there under the tutelage of a great scholar and great friend who I owe my career to him, is Philip Schlesinger. And Philip was the head of the Stirling Media Research Institute in that time. Today he's in Glasgow. And he basically sat down with me and says, I know that you're a journalist, and I know you're not used to write academic papers. And I know you don't know how to research in the way. I have done my PhD, so the PhD under Alan was great, but I never had this type of really focus that he gave me in the career. And that's where I really started. I think this is why I lasted in Stirling for so long, 12 years I did there. We created the Department of Journalism. We set up the first master's in financial journalism ever in the UK, then a master's in media management in Vietnam. And then from there I went to Sheffield, where I stayed 5 years at the University of Sheffield in the Department of Journalism, and finally I was offered a job in Leeds, and it was a great job in Leeds. And then Northwestern just showed up in the map, and they invited me to come here, and very grateful. And with this challenge here of setting, the graduate programs in the Middle East, which to me they're like this little guy from Maracaibo ends up in the Middle East. But it's been a fantastic journey. I of course I speak with nostalgia about my years as a journalist, and I continue to do a lot of journalism. I continue to write. I actually write occasionally to El Clarín there in Argentina and to the newspapers. Sadly, I don't write a lot more in Venezuela because I don't want to put in danger my family who's in Venezuela. But I write a lot in other places. We created a radio station here in Qatar in Spanish, the first Spanish and Portuguese speaking radio station in the Middle East. And it's, free to air. It's not just online. I tell people there, how did you get that? They says, no, we put together a project with a Qatari here, who's a very progressive, forward-looking guy who thought that the diaspora, the Hispanic and Latino diaspora, and the Luso diaspora, because that is Portuguese is also very important, deserve a radio. And now we're 1 year and 2 months old. And that's another interesting challenge. So it's been a very interesting journey, Pablo, very interesting journey. But it's been a lot of accidental stuff happening rather than me planning being here.
I hear you. And so for those who might not be entirely familiar with Venezuelan geography, could you tell people a little bit about your hometown, Maracaibo? I mean, where it sits in Venezuela, how big it is? I mean, is it a big metropolis, a small town? I mean,
Yeah, actually, it's the second city in Venezuela, but it's not that well known. It used to be much known. It used to actually be the Zulia state, where Maracaibo is the capital of Zulia state. Zulia state is very similar to Texas. It's in the northwest of Venezuela. It's in the border with Colombia. We're literally like an hour and a half, 2 hours from Colombia, depending, an hour or something if you go for a certain route from Colombia. It's the second city. It was built in, Maracaibo actually means in the indigenous language, the land of the snakes, of the cascabels, of the serpents, because that's what it means. Because apparently when the Spanish arrived there, they asked the people where to go and where to get water. And in Maracaibo, there was a lot of well water, but because of that, there was a lot of snakes, and the indigenous people call it the land of the snakes, Maracaibo, and funny enough, I mean, related to that, I mean, as all Latin Americans are very mixed, my from the side of my mother, my grandmother was indigenous, comes from the indigenous, from the people. There's the big Guajiro group, which is not really Guajiro, it's Guayu and Paraujano. We come from the Paraujano. From the side of my grandfather's side, there were also fishers, like the Paraujanos are. The fisher, the Guayu are the hunters, land gatherers, but the Guayus there. And then a mixture of even Jewish. We have one of my great-grandfather was Jewish and came into the picture. So this, cosmopolitan thing that you get in Latin America, which is very mixed in all sense. My father's side comes from a black family. Actually, we know because one of my brothers did the research. We're not Lugo. The thing is, the owner of the land and the slaves, which was normally what they call a bastard son. So it was somebody who couldn't inherit land in Spain because they were a bastard son of somebody, of an aristocrat. So when they arrived to the Americas, they were given land, but when they were asked their own name, they will say Lugo, from the region of Galicia. But then he will go to put this name to the slaves. So the slaves name all of the slaves in that area. This is the region of Encontrados, Bobures, in the south of the Lake of Maracaibo, were very black people, like my great-grandfathers, were black people. So there's a whole mixture there of the family history that leads. So if you go further, is getting to Adoha is really an amazing trajectory to somebody who's coming from those sides. But it's been an amazing one. I won't change anything on that side, but it's amazing things.
Yeah, I was gonna. That's why I asked. I mean, because it is quite a trajectory by way of Scotland and England, right?
Yes.
Which is also, I mean, Scotland is quite different from Venezuela and also from.
Yeah, actually. My friends in Britain used to joke because every time they saw me, I had a new job and it was constantly going north. So I went like, London, Liverpool, and then went to Scotland. And then I started going south, back to Leeds, and then out to Doha. So from north to south, But it's it's the life of the diaspora. You don't, once you leave your hometown, you basically really don't feel an attachment. I'm very grateful to the UK. It gave me a lot. Two of my three kids were born in the UK. Also, funny story. One of my sons was born in Scotland, but lives in England, and my son who was born in England lives in Scotland. So that's a completely different story. And my kid who was born in Venezuela and lived in Scotland now lives in Berlin. So the life of the intrinsic life of the diaspora and the Latino community. But we all, I mean, one of the things I think I made sure with the kids is that they conserve a lot of roots in terms of the Latino identity, and they eat arepa, they love, you know, Latino food, or, you know, they dance. You know, my oldest son is in Berlin, and he's going out and dancing salsa on the weekends, you know, and with us, and he speaks English with a strong Scottish accent. So there you go.
Yeah. So, and I mean, Berlin is a very cosmopolitan city, so I'm sure you can find excellent Venezuelan food there. I remember eating great arepas in a food truck in Berlin, in the Marshopus, the flea market. I can't remember another location, but there was a great arepa truck. Completely different story. So, but Jairo, I mean, you are very far from where you grew up, geographically speaking, yet your research has remained importantly strongly focused on Latin America, right?
Yeah.
How do you come to choose your research projects, and how much have they been influenced by your history and all of this migration?
Yeah. Well, you know, obviously you talk about what you know. I mean, most of us try to talk about what we actually know about. You know, I know some people talk about things they don't really know, but at least I try to talk what I. So my experience was as a journalist. I you know, in a way, in the UK they had this term called academics. I don't know if you have it in the United States. And these people who went from, well, in the UK they use a lot this term academics, which is people who went from journalism into academia. And which in the UK is a lot the case of a lot of journalists who work, let's say, BBC or Channel 4, and they ended all the Times or the Guardian, they end up working in academia. So I was an academic in that sense. You know, I went from being a journalist without really planning into this thing of teaching and research. And I started seeing that people were interested to know about what about the things, you know. So, for example, in Sterling, I met this really good scholar, good friend of mine who just passed away very recently, Brian McNair, and Brian wrote a lot, and so I started talking with Brian a lot. About you know, his work, and I said, well, you know, that might be the case in the UK, but that's not the case in the newspapers I work or in the radio stations I work in Latin America. This type of cultural. So he started listening to me, and then I started talking to other people like Stuart Allen, who also written about news cultures, and what I was bringing into the discussion was the fact that I actually lived the process. You know, I had done, without knowing it, I have done my ethnographic work by myself. And although things change, a lot of those cultures were still very prevalent. You know, why, you know, when I started looking, I started looking back in in 2001 or two with a grant of the Toda Institute of Japan. We started looking at coverage of asylum seekers and racism, and why certain journalists in the UK, from like, let's say, the Daily Mail or the Daily Express, were so overtly racist in the narratives, and why even when they hire, let's say, Black people or Asian people into the newsroom, and by Asian in the UK you mean Indian people from the Indian subcontinent in Pakistan, etc. Why even these people who they hired, who were from this community, you know, why they continue this narrative? And then we start understanding about, for example, that the organizational culture was far more powerful than the identity of the individual. And I could relate to that, because when I went to work in my first newspaper, which was a tabloid back in Maracaibo, it doesn't exist anymore, but it was called the La Columna. I realized that I went with all these ideal, romantic ideas about what I was going to do as a journalist, and when I arrived there, you know, before I blink, I was doing exactly the opposite of what I thought I was going to do. There were things I said, I'm never going to do this. When I work as a journalist, and nobody was really pressuring me, and nobody was telling me, oh, you need to write it this way, although there was some of that. But it was the peer pressure of the culture of the need of being accepted and assimilated into the organization that play a form. And I thought, you know, reflecting on that years later as an academic, say, I'm going to write this. And I'm going to see what other people say about this. And I started finding academics who wrote about that. And starting to link, one of the advantages I had in my research is that when I talk to editors of newspapers, for example, when I do my research on poverty, for example, they listen. And one of the reasons they listen is because they see me as one of them, even though I've been out of the academia. So, I know the process. I know you can't, there's a lot of people who rush to blame journalists for a bad job. I was doing some elements, some research years ago in a particular area, and there were a lot of the, in this case, scientists saying, oh, all the journalists are rubbish. They don't know what they're writing and blah, blah, blah. And why do they have to rush this headline? And I would say, well, because you don't understand the dynamics of the news. He's trying to sell his paper that day. He's trying to get somebody to pay for his salary. So if it's completely accurate to what you want him to say as a scientist, it's just not going to be published because his editor is not going to see any newsworthiness in the story. And I think that was a great breakthrough in understanding and being able to bridge between the academic, because the problem is on the other side too. I used to work with publishers all the time, with editors all the time. Even now in Doha, I've been meeting with some of the newspapers who want to improve their coverage in general, and they say, "Oh, but the academics don't write anything that is relevant to us." And I said, "That's rubbish. That's not true. What do you want to know about this thing?" And I give them 2 or 3 papers. "Oh, but this is not too convoluted." And I say, "Hang on a minute. Politicians read the papers that are produced by political scientists, and social services read the papers written by sociologists. Why can't the media read? Because it's critical to you, and you don't like to look. You like to criticize, but if you really want to change it, improve the media landscape, you have to read criticism against you." And something I'm going to tell you, and I said this to an editor back in London once. I said, the academics are not your enemy. They're not your enemy. If you read in between lines, what they're basically trying to do is ways of saving your industry. It's not the academics who. If you read this book, for example, of Jim Hall in 2020, in 2000, 20 years ago, he was telling the newspapers, you're not seeing the Craigslist here. You're going to miss the opportunity of making money. All these things classifieds. You needed to do it quickly. You need to do it online and free so you can conserve and keep that market and look for monetization in different ways. He was writing this 20 years ago. None of the newspapers put attention. And that's one of the things that I think we need to, it's not only a job of academia, because it already puts in academia the weight of, you need to create greater impact. You need to put forward your work, make it more accessible. No, I respond to that. The news media industry needs to listen more too. It's a two-way street. We have to encounter in the middle. They need us as much as we need them. In a way, our job can be meaningful if we change the way journalists. So years ago, this is even before Doha. But years ago, my work about poverty was, one of the things I did was when I got the publisher to give me 10 or 15 copies of my own books for free. And I went to London and I gave it to several journalists as a gift, And I wrote that book. This is Blaming the Victim and how the news media covers poverty. And I wrote that book purposely, deliberately. I wrote it very accessible in a way that read almost as a novel. And we had all these pressures. This was a challenge because, in Britain, we have all this pressure of the research assessment exercise, which is like this thing that every 4 or 5 years you're evaluated for your academic work. So there's a lot of pressure to write and publish in strictly academic terms, because that's the one that gets greater points in the system. And you want to get points so you can get additional resources. But deliberately, what I did was I wrote it in a very accessible way, that book. So the book hasn't really penetrated academia in that way, but it has penetrated a lot, because once they did a whole program about the book for example, in Al Jazeera. And this was things that it was because you make. So I think it's a two-way street. We have to make our work more accessible, and by accessible, not necessarily in the writing only, but also in the way how to get this work to them. So if I write a book normally from a research project, I normally try to write also a briefing of that book to give it to people who are in the industry. But also there must be an interest from the industry to come and listen to, and open to listen things, and not listen to criticism. Because I repeat, the criticism from the academia is not the enemy of the media. Sadly, many see it that way. Sadly, the New York Times, for example, got fed up of people writing books about the New York Times, and they're now very close to trying to charge people for using paragraphs, etc., of the newspaper. So they have the lawyers there, etc. I'm assuming that it's because they want to dissuade people from research. But I think that's a big mistake, because I don't think any of the academics, I know that a couple of radical academics who will hate the New York Times and want it to disappear, but the majority don't. The majority want actually the New York Times to succeed. It's just they want better journalism from the New York Times, from the Boston Globe, from the Washington Post, from CNN, and to that they have to be open. I'm not talking, of course, certain media, Alex Jones or Fox News, that's out of any. But even one of the first papers I wrote was about Fox News. How was Fox News changing the terms of debate? And now I didn't necessarily want, my criticism wasn't just criticism for the sake of it to Fox News. It's just that I think, the news should play a much beneficiary role in society.
Okay. So that's super interesting. I have two different kind of threads of follow-up questions. One, and I say both, and then you can pick up whichever or both you want to. So the first one is, now you have had the opportunity to work and do research in 3 different continents. So I was wondering whether you have seen sort of the reception of in the journalism community to the work that academics do varies, in a place like Venezuela versus, in Europe versus in the Arab Peninsula. That's number one. Number two is, what is the role that social media might play into this? Because I think a lot of, there tends to be conversations that include academics and journalists on social media. So, many don't, but some do. So I wonder where you think that, participating in social media, in particular on Twitter, might be sort of having an effect on the ability of each side to listen to the other. And I don't know, I'm curious.
Actually, I think both questions are really related. I think I will start with the first one, and I'll see, and I think it's related to the second one in a way. I'm not going to talk about 3 continents. I'm actually going to talk about different academic cultures, and I find very different cultures. Talking about Philip Schlesinger, who I mentioned. Many years ago, when I was still there, 2004, 2003, he gave me an article from an academic in Spain and asked me if I could translate it into Spanish. And Philip has done a remarkable job in bridging, way before anybody, in bridging between Latin Americans and Latin Americans and scholars and the rest of the world. He was the first one probably to translate Jesus Martín Barbero into English. He brought Garcia Canclini, in Sterling, even before I think Consumidores in Ciudadanos was published. The hybrid culture, he had these first debates with Canclini about the hybrid cultures and things like that. So there are very different, and they don't talk to each other. Definitely, or they talk very little to each other. And that was my experience. One of the things I found some years ago, we did a special issue. Andrés Cañizales in the Universidad Católica Andrés organized a special edition, a special book on on the contributions of Professor Antonio Pasquali, who passed away recently. And I had to write one of the essays of the book, and I started the essay saying that the book Pasquali, Comunicación Cultura, came a year before Raymond book on communication, and in those years, and honestly, the book of Pasquale is far more comprehensive with far more details about the same subject. But the book of Pasquale, at the best, have sold, I don't know, 5,000 copies probably, and Raymond's book is probably in the millions. And the academia reflects the monopoly of knowledge or the oligopoly of knowledge created by resources. If you are in a university well-resourced, even now that I switched from a British university to a US university, you can see the huge difference of resources to do research, etc. So when I say that the academias don't talk to each other, it's not only in terms of the language, it's also in terms of the way they do research, the way they approach research, and I'm not evaluating which is better or which is worse, because I don't think that's the point, and it's not definitely a point, But it doesn't talk. People in the endogamia, the closeness, self-center of academia is a theme of all the academias. No, I'm not saying here that the US doesn't listen to the South. No, the South does. If you go to a conference of ALIC, and I love the people from ALIC, the Association of Latin American Communication Research, I try to go as much as I can, and I keep in touch. They're doing now the one in Medellin, where in a few days there's going to be November in Medellin, Colombia, although online. And but you rarely hear people from them, even when they're Latinos. I was surprised when I asked people like in Colombia, Venezuela, have you read this book of Silvio Weisberg? And Silvio is one of the, as you know, or Pablo's work. No. No, how can you know? It's in Spanish. You can't even say that it's not there. So I'm not saying this is a sin only there, but I think there's a big problem that the academias do not talk to each other. And that's why I said that the two questions were related, because one of the great things of social media was the fact that it allows people to talk to each other, and that it cuts horizontally in a way we didn't have before. I mean, let's face it, if you had a journal like Opción from the University of Zulia, where I studied my first degree, and Opción is a great magazine, publishes great stuff, and it's actually indexed in Q1, and it's been Q1 for years. Now, ask how many people in, Northwestern, how many people have heard of Opción? Nobody, and it's a great magazine, It's funny because I saw some candidates in a job application we posted, and I saw this candidate who actually had a huge numbers of pieces published in journals Q1, and I said, how can this guy so young get so many journal publications in Q1 in so little time? And it's the guy had identified all these little journals across the world, in Bangladesh, in Venezuela, in Bolivia, and they were all Q1, but there was this little that nobody heard, so nobody sent articles there, and they met the criteria that they were in index, like in Reuters and Scopus in Q1. So they found obviously this system of publishing. So here we are all competing to get published in journalism studies or in journalism or in journal quality communication or press and politics. And this guy went on the back and he publishes in all these little places, gets the same award because he gets a Q1, and gets published. And I thought, oh God, that's smart. That's really smart. But that is because the academias don't work. And I found this phenomenon. I went to Pakistan some years ago to do a series of lectures in Ikra University in Karachi. And again, the same problem. They didn't even listen to what the people in India were writing. and they were both writing in English. They were both writing in English, and they didn't know. So it was me, a guy from Venezuela who was in that time living in the UK, who came to Pakistan telling them that this guy in India is researching the same topic that he's doing. and there you go. So I think that's one of the things I've enjoyed the most, is trying to help people to network, even if I'm not involved. And most time I'm not involved in a way. So I just put people together. I met, not to take credit, but my former PhD candidate student, Scott Eldridge, who's now in Groningen, a professor in Groningen University in Holland, and I met this other guy from Miguel from the Ramon Llull University in Barcelona. And I noticed they were both working the same thing. And I said, mate, you need to talk to each other. And they start talking, and the book, that was 3 or 4 years ago, the book just came out, and I think we need, with social media, we need to use it better. I mean, a lot of people use it more to promote themselves, in the sense like, how many, to go to, I don't know, academics.edu or whatever to promote, and, part of their networking. But I think the networking has to happen more horizontally. I see that, people like you, Pablo, with this center are fundamental in this task of bringing people together. One of the things I love was seeing, for example, Raisa Rivarin, my old professor from the University of Zulia, in the chat room, and with mixing up, and some of you asking me, who's this woman? I says, oh, she's a wonderful scholar that nobody heard of, because everything she has published has been in Spanish and published by, I don't know, the University Press of Zulia, which now disappear, and all the books are gone or something, and would never digitalize, because this was the time before digitalization. And this, I think we need to do more there. But I think that social media, the social platforms, present a unique opportunity to this, to do this cross-pollination and cross-collaboration between different people, And I think this is, when people talk about, when James Curran and Pack talked about de-Westernizing media, and that famous book that opened all this movement, or now this whole movement of decolonizing media studies, I always say it's a horizontal communication. This is not getting rid of things. I don't believe in getting rid of knowledge. It's about adding, combining, enriching the knowledge that we have. And Sylvia Weisbord wrote a very good piece some 2 or 3 years ago on about the function of Latin American studies in media studies, and how it can help us challenge and question some of the global assumptions. This is, as this is you probably have experienced this when I talk about Venezuela, and I by mistake make a generalization. Oh, the journalism is like that because in Venezuela. Say, oh, but that's in Venezuela. That doesn't happen in other. That don't generalize, don't universalize. That's in Venezuela. But then a colleague of mine from the UK said, oh, this is the way journalism does things, because my study in London shows that. Come on, like you can generalize. That's universal. Not what I'm saying is universal. Anyway, I think we all of us needs to be less presumption about the universality of the knowledge we generate, and instead think of it as a more complementary elements of knowledge, like a puzzle that we're all going to put together, but it's never going to be completed, and it's never going to be the whole picture. It's just going to be something that allows us insight into reality, and and I think that's the task, the task to understand. In the past, I think it was too much about asking how this or that theory could explain this reality, and I think that that now the question is more about what type of theory we can derive from each one of these cases. And I think you can see that in many scholars. I mean, definitely you can see it, for example, with Paolo Mancini and Dan Halin, who started by trying to define the world in this term of the media systems. And today we got a far more complex, far more rich, elaborated notion of media systems, and not only nationally, but even regionally with the work of Julieta Brambilla, Mireya in Mexico, etc. And it's far more rich than we would have had if we had stayed with this notion of like how this big model explained this reality. Well, no, it's not like that. It's like what reality can you understand from the reality itself? And I think that's much more rich. So I think both. I think we need to talk about different academias, but we also need to think about these academias much more interlinked by the social media.
Okay, now staying on the different academias, so they all coexist, but some are richer than others. Some have a bit more centrality than others, right?
Yes.
And some of us, myself included, think that that's impoverishing to everybody. But how can we help those at the center realize that they are impoverishing themselves, right? Because when you are the owner of the ball, so to speak, you want to score all the goals. And you don't know what others to score goals against you. So, I mean, this is probably not the best metaphor, but yeah, you know, what have you learned after so many years? I mean, because you are not only a very accomplished scholar, but you are also an academic entrepreneur. I mean, you have created and directed programs in different parts of the world. And you are also an entrepreneur in industry. I mean, you started a radio, right? I mean, Spanish and Portuguese language radio in Doha, which is, you know, quite remarkable. So what have you learned from all of these sort of building structures of knowledge about how to, you know, bridge across these different cultures so that there is less of a center periphery, less of an asymmetry in terms of distribution of power?
Okay. I mean, it's a challenge, you know, and you're absolutely right. You know, we say like the song of the Panamanian singer, one of my favorites, Rubén Blades. ¿Por qué te desaparecen? Porque no todos somos iguales. Why they disappear you? Because we're not all equal. And that metaphor really works because it's the invisible knowledge there. And I think you're absolutely right. When you have invisible knowledge, then everybody's poorer. But I would dispute, however, that it's just because of resources, you know, because it's not only resources. For the great part of the 20 years I've been in academia now, for example, the Germans were invisible. It's only recent that you have people like Thomas Hanich and other starting to show up in the mainstream discussions, but they didn't even go to ICA or they didn't go to IMCR, you know, very few of them. They have their own, and they are a very rich academia. I mean, believe me, they have lots of money for research. The Volkswagen research, they have lots of money. It's not about, they've been more self-marginalized than actually marginalized, you know. So yes, there's an issue there, but it's not only an issue of resources. There's an issue of cultures, of, you know, the academic systems is built in every country, in every society in specific way to reward certain things. For example, in the UK, you have this research assessment exercises that every 5 years, everybody is evaluated. The university gets money because of it or doesn't get money because of it. So everybody's geared up to that. And it has worked for the Brits. You know, the Brits with far less resources than the US has probably the second academia in the world in terms of numbers of publications and copyrights, etc. So it's a very efficient way, but it's also a way that it gears up to people into getting particular resources. And you early asked me, you know, what led you to get in this or that area? Not every area I have explored in research has been for will. It's just areas that there were resources there, and we apply to get them. And you know, if you ask certain academic scholars, why did you do this work? It's because I got the grant. and not necessarily because that was, we can't be naive to say, a lot of the best work I've done, I did it without money and or resources. It was just because that was really what I wanted to do. So but it's not a lot of time you have. And the same in the UK, in the US. I mean, the US, where you're chasing this golden goose called tenure, and you got all these people, as John said. I mean, I don't have to tell you stories about that. So it's not only about money and about resources that the academia, it's also the system itself that is built in a way that people are channeled to certain particular things. And that means they don't look to the sides. This idea of the old academics of the Middle Ages, the universities in that monastery in which you just look for knowledge and you talk and learn languages, but also you got this guy like, the Renaissance, like Da Vinci, who knows about engineering, music, painting, et cetera, et cetera. You can't afford that anymore. You can barely read. I haven't read a novel in probably 8 years or 10 years, because I have to read all this other stuff that I have to teach or research. So the system itself is built for that. But also the other thing is there's two issues. There's an issue, I think, in the center, and there's an issue in the periphery. In the center, there's an issue of humbleness, of knowing that you don't know everything, that just because you are a cited scholar who gives a talk doesn't mean that you know things. It only means that you've been lucky and privileged to do a great job. I love academia. And to as I say, as I was describing to my wife once, what do I do? And says, I basically get paid to read, which I would learn for free anyway. But I think in the center, in the periphery, we're in these universities, Europeans, we need much more humbleness and understand that the other knowledge is very valuable and that we should listen, but really listen. Not just quote and understand, but actually listen. And people will be amazed about, I saw a book some years ago, and I'm not going to mention the book or the scholar because he's a very nice guy and he did it on purpose. But the book had the same title that the book of an academic in Latin America who's written this basically the same book 10 years before, and not a single citation. And I am 100% sure that this academic, I'll tell you the name afterwards of the record, but don't want to, get it here. But I'm sure that the academic who did this book he did not know about even the existence of the other academic, he didn't really realize that. And there was probably not in his mind that he could go to Google Scholar and look and adapt Google Scholar so it looks to all the, all these things. And I was amazed when I was working with my book on poverty, because one of the chapters co-authored by my then PhD students, Patrick Malaulo, who's a Nigerian, and he introduced me to all this wonderful literature of scholars in Nigeria who had written about lots of stuff which you didn't get in any of the big journals. I mean, Herman Hesman, Westerman in South Africa, and Cape Town University, had done a brilliant job with his journal of the Journal of African Studies, and he got funding so the journal is more accessible to scholars, and he gets teams of people to help scholars because we're not all scholars write in the American Psychological Association style, and none of them are used to writing the science, but they still have we in our journal, the Journal of Applied Journalism and Media Studies, Leon Barco, who's the editor, I'm the deputy editor, we published, for example, the first ever article about journalism in Haiti. And we realized when we published that article, which was a struggle because it was to be an academic in Haiti, and this was just after the fall of Aristide, of Jean-Bertrand Aristide, to write this piece. The guy was like literally driving a taxi and then going to do his classes because that's the only way he could make ends meet. And so we assigned him an editor to help him, and he managed to publish. And it's a brilliant article. It's one of the most cited articles of our journal because anybody who has to write anything about Haiti has to reference that article because it was like the first one to be published in English in that term. And I think that is part of the humbleness. And I think this is happening, in a way, I think the journals We, for example, in my journal, and I'm not really trying to promote my journal, but it's something that Leon Leon has done it brilliantly. Leon is from Sweden, but he secured that at least half of our journal editorial board, more than half actually now, is women, and 70% are people from the Global South. And this is a journal that is now, widely indexed, very well indexed, is Q2, Q1 in some cases, and this was a conscious decision. And I think journals all over the world need to start looking, without losing quality, without compromising quality. I think they need to give voices to people and create mechanisms to allow people to participate. But I think there's also an issue of the Global South, and the issue of the Global South is access to resources. And to do good research, you do need resources. And there's no other way around that. If you want to do an ethnographic or survey or semi-terrestrial interviews, you're going to have to need resources. And it's amazing how much they do with very little in general. But I think there's an issue there. There's resources. I mean, how many academics can afford next year to go to Denver, to the ICA? And I'm not even talking about the hotel and the trip. I'm talking about the $200-300 that you have to pay for the research. And the ICA has, on all fairness, lots of scholarships. People donate money for that, etc. But it's the structure itself. It's just not accessible. Now, this is considered the world top forum for media scholars in communication. But I'm sorry, it's not. I'm sorry, it's like the baseball, like the US likes to call the World Series. Sorry, it's the only baseball teams that plays it from the US. They used to have the Blue Jays, who used to be based in Canada, but that's no longer the case. So no, sorry. So I'm sorry, ICA is not the forum. So, and I go to ICA and I participate because I learn, I think that brilliant work. So I'm not demeriting the importance of the work, because as I said earlier, this is not about de-Westernizing and decolonizing. It's not about subtracting. It's about adding knowledge to enrich all of us. And so what we need to do is to look to ways for people who can participate. And I think the mixed blessing of COVID-19, which has been a terrible and damaging event for all the academia and humanity as such, but for academia, where a lot of people are going to lose their jobs or are in danger of losing their jobs, is tough. But one of the very few things that has happened is that oblige us to reconsider the way we interact with others, to do this type of events that you're doing, in which you actually use technologies, social platforms to be more inclusive. And I think that's something that the ICA and MCR, they're doing, of course, their event more inclusively, but why don't have, free forums, or they have the regional chapters and all that. And I'm very conscious and aware of all the really good efforts, but I'm saying as a structure, as a center, we think that both we have to be more humble in the center, and include myself as now member of this family in the North, in the global. Not I'm in the global South, but I'm part of a U.S. university, and I'm talking about resources, but also to think of ways in which we can help our sisters and brothers in the global South to overcome the limitations and the obstacles that will allow them to engage and participate more actively in the sharing of knowledge, and that includes language, etc. And it's funny because a lot of the journals now in the South are having, the editions are in different languages, which is, I think it's a great, there's still a European language, but it's great. I found out years ago about the Journal of Brazilian Journalism Research, which is a great journal, very well, but I only found it out because Stuart Allen published an article there. And I'm a Latin American. I didn't know about this journal, so I'm not excusing. I'm not saying this is a sin of my Northern colleagues. I am part of that problem. I'm part of that problem, and that's why I'm still reflecting that I think we as a group, as a whole, including myself, need to think, be more humble, and also think about ways in which we can engage these people outside better.
All right, I couldn't think of a better way to end this great conversation, Jairo. This has been super enlightening, super interesting. Thank you for your time. And I invite everybody to tune in again next week for the next episode of El Café Latinx. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
El Café Latinx is a production of the Center for Latinx Digital Media in the Department of Communication Studies at Northwestern University. I am Pablo Boczkowski, your host, and I'm joined by executive producer Mora Matassi.